Ernesto Montilla faced a charge of murder, but before the trial even began, he made a calculated legal maneuver. He admitted to killing the victim, Ronnie Lapidante, claiming he did it in self-defense. Under Philippine criminal procedure, pleading self-defense functions as an absolute admission of authorship. The accused owns the act. This admission triggers a unique procedural mechanism known as a reverse trial. This diagram of a judicial scale illustrates the immediate effect. The onus probandi, or burden of proof, shifts completely from the prosecution to the defense. The prosecution no longer has to prove the defendant committed the crime. To secure an acquittal, the defense must now bear the entire weight of proving justification, relying completely on its own evidence, rather than searching for weaknesses in the prosecution's case. But a self-defense claim built on physical impossibilities will collapse. If the defendant's description of the event violates the basic laws of physics and common human experience, the defense fails. Invoking self-defense is a high-risk legal gambit. By admitting the killing, the accused guarantees their own conviction if they cannot construct a physically plausible narrative of justification. The revised Penal Code, under Article 11, Paragraph 1, classifies self-defense as a justifying circumstance. If proven, it completely exempts an accused from criminal liability. This structure outlines the statutory requirements for self-defense, with unlawful aggression as the foundational base. This requires an actual, imminent, and unlawful physical attack. A mere threatening attitude isn't enough. Without this foundation, the other elements lose their footing, and the entire claim collapses. Montilla attempted to build his case on a specific narrative of unlawful aggression. He claimed that Lapidante forced open a door, entered the house, and drew a homemade firearm, locally known as a pugalit. Because Montilla had already admitted to the killing, his freedom depended entirely on whether the trial court believed Lapidante actually drew a weapon first. According to Montilla's testimony, when Lapidante produced the firearm, Montilla instinctively grappled with him to gain possession of it. Montilla introduced a highly specific detail to the struggle. He claimed he managed to get hold of the gun's nozzle, and while he was holding it, the weapon suddenly discharged, hitting Lapidante. This kinematic diagram isolates the anatomy of a firearm, highlighting the rear trigger assembly and the front nozzle. Mechanics dictate a fired projectile exits the nozzle. If Lapidante held the trigger and Montilla gripped the nozzle, it points directly at Montilla. The medical records confirmed Lapidante died from a gunshot wound that entered his left mid-abdomen. If Montilla's hand was on the nozzle as he claimed, the weapon would have discharged directly into Montilla, not into the man holding the grip. Evaluating this geometry, the trial court found Montilla's testimony exasperatingly inadequate and contrary to the natural order of things. An uncorroborated, self-serving statement that contradicts common experience cannot meet the rigorous standard of clear and convincing evidence required in a reverse trial. When physical geometry contradicts a witness's testimony, the physical mechanics prevail. Without a plausible narrative, the claim of unlawful aggression was dismantled. With the self-defense justification mathematically disproven, the court turned to the prosecution's corroborated account of the events. The prosecution witnesses established that Lapidante and his companions were unarmed, seated inside a house, waiting to be served coffee. Montilla entered the house carrying a firearm and, following a command, shot the seated Lapidante without any prior warning. This method of execution introduces the qualifying circumstance of treachery, or Alevosia. This spatial map demonstrates the core principle of Alevosia, adopting methods that ensure the crime is committed without risk to the offender. Even a sudden, unexpected frontal assault qualifies if it targets an unarmed victim who is completely off guard. The suddenness of the gunshot completely deprived Lapidante of any opportunity to defend himself or repel the assault. The presence of Alevosia legally elevates what would otherwise be a standard homicide into the severe charge of murder under Article 248 of the revised Penal Code. On appeal, the Supreme Court noted that reviewing tribunals must rely on the cold and mute pages of the records. Because the trial court had the distinct opportunity to observe the deportment of the witnesses firsthand, its assessment of their credibility is accorded binding respect. The Supreme Court affirmed the conviction, finding Montilla guilty of murder and sentencing him to reclusion perpetua. However, the court modified the financial damages to align with the modern jurisprudence established in the case of People v. Giugietta. This breakdown shows the standardized civil liabilities awarded to the victim's heirs: 75,000 pesos each for civil indemnity, moral damages, and exemplary damages, plus 50,000 pesos in temperate damages. The court awarded temperate damages in lieu of actual damages because evidence of burial expenses was missing. All awarded damages will earn a 6% interest per annum until fully paid. The Supreme Court's ruling ensures that both the penal and civil consequences are standardized and inescapable once a defendant fails to meet the shifted burden of proof. Pleading self-defense completely rewrites the rules of a criminal trial by lifting the burden of proof from the prosecution and placing it squarely onto the accused. A legal defense built on a physical impossibility, like a bullet defying its own trajectory, cannot survive judicial scrutiny. In the Philippine legal system, the justification for taking a life must satisfy statutory requirements, and it must withstand the unyielding laws of physical science.